I think this is a good issue to start with, to use as a contribution to Nexus. It affects Iceland's security as much as it affects anyone else. I know that there have been other talks recently on the issue of the situation in the Arctic. I attended a very good talk by Alyson Bailes, for example, last week. The novel part in my approach, or the different part in my approach, is to start and end with the Nordic states and what does this mean for them, rather than asking what it means for the great powers or Europe in general. And I'm going to start by reminding you that the Nordic states, at least for 2 centuries, maybe 3 centuries, have a permanent strategic issue. Since Russia grew to be a great power from Peter the Great onwards, the neighbor of the Nordics is always going to be more powerful than all the Nordics put together, in terms of population, in terms of economy, and of course in military terms. There's no escaping from that. And when you live next to such a very powerful neighbor, you're in an asymmetrical position in technical terms. There is one obvious strategy which the Nordics have been consistently following, and most people would say consistently, successfully following for most of the last 200 to 300 years. And that is a double track strategy. And it's maybe no accident that in the 1970s, NATO itself adopted a double track strategy, pretty close to Nordic thinking. So what are the 2 strands? One is obviously to be serious about defense, to be aware of the possible threat, to be aware that you cannot deal with the threat on your own, and it would be very foolish and a waste of time to try to do that. So the idea of a kind of separate Nordic defense alliance has been consistently rejected every time it came up, and instead the solution has been to rely on great powers and great organizations. And since the 20th century, that means the United States and NATO. So there is a solution, hopefully a solution for hard defense, but it does require depending on other people and on their willingness to help the Nordics should it be necessary. The other, and perhaps the more interesting part, is to pretend that there isn't a defense threat. There is a grand word for that, which is desecuritization, according to theories developed by the Copenhagen School of Security Analysis. To desecuritize something is just to pretend that something is not there, even if it obviously is a threat. Even if you are dealing with it in the first wing of your policy, in the second wing of your policy, you work around it. Obviously, you don't forget it, but you work around it, and you have a way of behaving as if that was not there, and as if your big neighbor was just that, a neighbor, someone that you have certain things in common with. You have the responsibility to manage the space that you live in together with the neighbor, and maybe you can find useful aspects of cooperation. You can get to know each other at a human level, etc., etc. So this second wing of the policy means behaving to Russia in a neighborly way, in the way that you would like Russia to behave to you. Now, as I say, this has worked pretty well for 100, 150 years, maybe, but the conditions for pursuing the policy have changed very considerably during that time, and especially since the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. For most of Europe, that had the effect of pushing back the Russian presence and the Russian threat. Russian troops were cleared out of Central and Eastern Europe. There is no ally for Russia until you get to Belarus. In the north, that actually didn't change so much. Russia is still there on the border with the Nordic states, as it always was. It has not been pushed back. So the question over northern security has always been there. It hasn't gone away in the sense that the question for, let's say, Luxembourg or Austria or especially Portugal has gone away. However, there has been a difference in that NATO has been extended along the south shore of the Baltic to Poland and the Baltic states, and it means that the danger of Russian military action through the Baltic is very much less than it was. Essentially, I would say the Baltic is a Western Sea. So if you're looking for the military boundary with Russia, or if you're looking for the place where Russia could potentially break out to start military action, that is now the Arctic. That role has shifted from Central Europe and the Baltic. The Arctic is now really the only place where that might happen. Not by coincidence, it is the largest part of the Russian fleet. It is probably the largest part of their strategic nuclear force. There are still quite important troop concentrations in the area of the Kola Peninsula. Now, obviously, when the Arctic becomes the only really sharp strategic frontier with Russia, that is going to affect the Nordic states. And it affects them more because the Arctic is, well, their own world as well. It's not a distant issue where they can more or less choose to be involved or not, as they did in Afghanistan. It is their own world, their own life, and they are being affected by climate change, which is the other great new factor, or increasing factor, it would be more correct to say. Now, why does the Arctic matter for the Nordic states? As usual, it's a very mixed picture of hopes and fears. I guess I don't have to talk through this in detail because it's a very, very similar picture for Iceland itself. Iceland has a very clear Arctic policy preceded by good analysis by the Foreign Ministry, and we know pretty much what the agenda is here. There are hopes of new sustainable exploitation of Arctic resources, not just oil and gas, but rare minerals, for example. There are hopes of an increase in trade and shipping, where the smaller countries might at least get some benefit from providing services, from being part of new shipping routes. There are chances that fish will increase overall in the Arctic area, although, of course, they will be moving around somewhat from one zone to another, but it does look as if the zones where Iceland traditionally fishes will be ones where fish overall will increase. There is a chance to continue with the globalization and the opening up of Nordic economies by easier links to Asia, for example, and greater possibilities for Asian powers to come in and invest in this region. And all that might have a good social impact by not just providing money, because money without work is not healthy for a society, but there is a chance of new jobs, new specialities, and a broadening of the economic base for economies like those of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroes, which at the moment risk standing on just one leg or maybe two or three legs. Now, the risks, the fears are very great. Obviously, all the Nordics would lose out terribly if the Arctic developments caused a conflict. More likely is that an existing conflict in southern Europe, for example, could spread up here. And that probably is point number one, really, in all Nordic policies, to try to avoid that, to do anything they can to avoid it. What I'd like to stress is that that is not the same as avoiding militarization. The interests of the Nordic states are not necessarily against having strong military forces in the area. After all, Denmark and Norway, which are very peaceful, responsible states, are planning to make their own northern defences more efficient. The point is that military forces in the Arctic can do many positive things. They can patrol areas which are newly opened up to make sure that people respect the law, that there is no illegal fishing, smuggling, terrorism, whatever might be coming into these new open areas. And very importantly, they can monitor for accidents, and they can help rescue people, and they can help clean up oil spills and all those other things. And they can help with natural disasters or accidents on land. We should not forget the risks of those. So the military are possibly okay, conflict obviously not okay. The climate itself is bringing more extreme conditions, extremes of cold and heat, extremes of wind, many more storms this winter than normal, as I'm sure you have noticed. And last week, when I was in the Faroes, they had snow all week. And that has never happened before in the Faroes in the middle of May. So there is a general destabilization of the climate. that in itself could start leading to accidents or disasters, even in the activity that is already happening. It's important to stress that. This is something that could happen tomorrow. But of course, if there is then a further growth of human activity, of oil wells, new cables, more shipping, it will just increase the target that could be hit by these natural disasters and accidents. And any accident of that sort is liable to cause oil pollution or other pollution, which could damage the fish and damage the clean image of fish coming from this part of the world, which is so important economically for all the Nordics. And all these things can have negative social impact, and indeed health developments in a warming climate are going to bring new challenges for human health, food safety, and of course the health of animals and of wild nature. Now, the real point on this slide is the bit at the bottom. And I'm sure I don't need to talk this through in detail, because I think it will be clear to you that both for the hopes and for the fears, Russia is central. It has the biggest Arctic territory, the biggest Arctic waters, the biggest share of the expected oil and gas resources are in Russian waters, and indeed, according to the Marine Institute here, the biggest share of new fish will also be in Russian waters. And of course, it controls the main commercial route for shipping over Siberia. And of course, it is also the obvious source of military danger, as it has been since the time of Peter the Great. So the Nordics cannot expect to achieve their hopes or to avoid their fears without correct handling of the relationship with Russia. And I hope you agree that it's okay to talk about the Nordics here, because although Norway, Denmark and Iceland are the ones that have territory actually facing the Arctic Ocean, Arctic issues have become very much more important and serious in the policies of Sweden and Finland, who have, of course, very far northern land territories being affected by all this, and they would very much like to be a part of the commercial and technological development, and they would like to be part of finding the social and environmental solutions. So I think it's fair here to talk about all the Nordics, of course, including the Faroes and Greenland. Now, in the middle of this already complicated picture comes the Russian action in Crimea and in the Ukraine, and the Western reactions against this. They have affected the Arctic. We have to accept that to start with. The question is, how far have they affected the Arctic? And here it is important to look very closely and not to jump to any very simple conclusions. Now, one thing that has definitely happened is the stopping of military cooperation. There had been quite extensive military visits, for example, exchanged between Norway and Russia, and those have all been stopped. In a similar way, meetings of military leaders which had been taking place to discuss how to implement the search and rescue agreement of the Arctic Council and how to continue military cooperation against oil spills, these have not been able to take place with Russia. One meeting was delayed and another took place without Russia. So the military side is pretty much frozen for the moment. High-level political exchanges and visits have been stopped. The activities have not necessarily been stopped, we will see this later, but they are being carried out at a lower political level, less provocative. Western countries and banks are not allowed to provide finance for new ventures to do with oil exploration in the far north. One has to be careful about the impact of this. It is potentially serious for Russia in the medium to long term, but it does not go backwards. It does not affect agreements that had already been entered into. And there are a number of companies, including Norway's Statoil company, which still have projects going on with the Russians. This is affecting new planning. And the Russians are reacting by putting even more emphasis on developments on land where they have less need of foreign technology. The Yamal Peninsula has always been their biggest short-term project, and they have hopes, of course, of getting help from China, although it's another question whether China is actually ready to give that on any significant scale. Now, of course, Russia has reacted against the Western sanctions, more particularly by banning food imports from everywhere except Iceland and the Faroes. and that has definitely affected Norwegian fish exports, and it has affected a wide range of Finnish food exports, which fell already by about a half last year, and I would imagine that they have continued falling. Now, some people go immediately from the idea of these sanctions to look at a certain slowing down in Arctic development, and to say that one is the cause of the other. Now, I think we have to be very careful about this because there are other very important factors involved. Most importantly, the slump in the global oil price, and with the signs that the oil price will remain quite low for some time. This in itself would actually be enough to call some of Russia's future projects in question. If there isn't the demand for the oil, the commercial calculation doesn't make sense to invest large amounts of money now in developing it. And in fact, even oil-related investments in more traditional areas like the Middle East are being held up or reduced. So it's not a surprise that there is more caution and less new activity in this more risky and uncertain area of the Arctic. Russia, of course, is suffering very badly financially from the loss of oil income, on top of the fact that its behavior has just caused the private market to distrust it more anyway. So there is less commercial willingness for cooperation and investment. But that is only to a limited degree the effect of Western sanctions. The dynamics of the world oil market are much more important here. And one might say similar things about the rather surprising development in shipping over Siberia, over what Russia calls the Northern Sea Route, because I'm sure you've heard by now that the number of ships making the full journey from east to west dropped last year. It had been around 70 in 2013, and in 2014 it was barely 20. I think it was 23. And people had applied for permits, and Russia had granted the permits, so that it doesn't seem to be a political reaction. But the people had simply not been able to make the journeys, and one of the very simple reasons was that the weather was worse, and the route was not completely safe and ice-free until August last year, so there was hardly time to make all the trips that were expected. And I think people were just finding it too expensive and not as profitable as they thought, because it had already been noticed in 2012-13 that the great majority of the ships that made the journey were going back empty. There was cargo available one way, but not the other way. And that's quite a serious point, which does raise questions about the longer-term rise in shipping. So yes, there has been a cutback, there has been a slowdown in all the symptoms of Arctic development. The Economist has been talking about an Arctic bubble that has already burst. Well, that may be a bit hasty because we don't know what will happen in the medium term, but what we can say that this is not, quotes, the fault of Western sanctions. That seems to have been only a very small factor. Now, at the same time, the cooperative neighbourly side of affairs in the Arctic has gone on remarkably unchanged. Now, I start here by mentioning organisations that are not so often thought about in this context, but there are two very efficient, very popular sub-regional groupings, the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, which deals with cooperation on land in the northerly part of Finland, Sweden, Norway and Russia, and the Northern Dimension, which is a programme of the EU together with Norway, Iceland and Russia, devoted to investment in projects throughout this area, including the Arctic parts. And they have just gone on as normal, and there are plans for further expanding them. And in fact, the Northern Dimension ministers are meant to meet in Iceland later this year, and there is a senior officials meeting, I think this week or next week, and Norway and Iceland have been coming forward with proposals to do even more together with Russia in that particular framework. So it's interesting to note those, but then if we look at the Arctic Council, which is the central organisation for Arctic cooperation, and this has been much more reported in the media, the ministerial meeting in Canada, 24 to 5 April, went ahead as planned. It was not completely normal. There were some glitches in the preparations where you have a big range of working groups on particular topics who are preparing results for the council, And there were one or two related to oil spill pollution where either the West didn't attend at the level it normally would or Russians did not attend. But it seems that the majority of the preparatory meetings, including those of the senior officials representing the governments, did go ahead as normal. And when it came to the event, a Russian minister did attend, but very interestingly, was not Foreign Minister Lavrov. It was the Environment Minister, whose name I forget. Donskoy, somebody may know. I think it may have been Donskoy. The point was that it was felt probably too provocative to have Lavrov turning up and being greeted as a great friend in Canada when he has been one of those most actively justifying the Russian action in Crimea and Ukraine, and he is personally very much associated with that policy. But it was clearly felt that an environment minister was not provocative in the same way, and indeed there is an interesting Canadian online blog by Heather Exner-Piro, a good academic who has often visited Iceland, and the story she tells is that during the meeting, the Canadian representatives were quite insulting or critical towards the Russians. They did take the chance to say how they felt about Ukraine, and the poor environment minister just had to sit there and listen to it, although it was not his personal responsibility. But that all the other countries then came in saying really nice things and saying how glad they were that this guy had turned up and how this all symbolized the great future of cooperation, so that in the end the Canadians were left looking like the bad guys. I may say, I don't know if there's anyone from Canada here, but Canada's handling of its chairmanship of the Arctic Council has in general not been great. That's all I will say. And that people are really looking forward to the US, which will take over now. And ironically, that may be more of a guarantee of calm and cooperative handling, because the US so far has a rather modest policy towards the Arctic and handles its relationship with China at the other end of the Arctic in the Bering Strait very peacefully and very well, so far as we can see. And certainly the first signs given by the US chairmanship is that they want to focus on the environment, on the issue where common interests are greatest, and an area which you could say has sort of moral value. And so that implies that they will try to keep any political antagonism out of it as much as possible. There is still a very good program for action by the Arctic Council. I won't go into detail about the Iqaluit Declaration because you can find it online, but it does mention, maybe 5 or 6 very concrete areas where the cooperation will develop, and one that I think is maybe of special interest for Iceland and the other Nordics, that there is to be a study on regional seas, and the idea is to find out here what are the most vulnerable or important parts of the Arctic Ocean from a climate-related or nature-related point of view, and to look at the devices that are open to Arctic states to preserve or protect some of these, to limit the areas that ships can use and so forth. That has actually been a part of Iceland's policy for several years. Iceland has restricted the shipping lanes that can be used around the southwest corner, for example, in the interests of safety. The Faroes are keen to do it, but have to check out their legal possibilities. So I think that particular idea, although popular with NGOs, it is of practical value for Nordic countries, and it underlines that it is very much in their interests, and it is partly their achievement, actually, that the Arctic Council should continue operating in a maybe 90% normal way. Now, back to the Nordics, I would just like to delve a little bit further into what the Nordic states have actually been doing at the level of their national policies. This is really interesting, and I hope to be able to do further research into it, but these are just my preliminary findings. And I'll start with the side of defence. Now, in March, the Nordic defence ministers held a meeting, and a few days afterwards they published a joint article in Norway's leading newspaper, Aftenposten. And it was rather a strange letter because it said some quite aggressive things about Russia. I mean, for all these years that the Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Finns have been keeping a strong defence, they've been quite careful not to say too much about who are they defending against. They haven't felt it necessary to say that because it's very obvious. But in this letter in Aftenposten, they did talk about Russia all the time. They condemned the intervention in Ukraine. They mentioned provocative local behavior by Russia. You know, there have been sea and air incidents, although interestingly, they have been more in the Baltic and less in Nordic territory. They mentioned that Russia was spreading propaganda and disinformation and that it was trying to split the Nordics from each other. All that is true, of course that's true, but it was a little unusual that the ministers would say so in such plain terms. And then they said that because of this, the Nordic countries, at least those that have armed forces, would cooperate further in information intelligence, that's situational awareness. They would particularly strengthen their cyber security cooperation. They would hold more joint exercises, and they would try to be more serious about joint procurement, which is buying the same weapon system. They have been trying to do that for a very long time, but with somewhat limited success. For Norway and Denmark, I would argue that this was a little bit like sort of adjusting a dial on something. Their policies are already aiming in that direction, is what I would like to say. They just have to sort of turn them up a little bit. For Finland and Sweden, of course, this has posed very much more fundamental questions, because they may be protected in practice by NATO's strategic power and by the US nuclear shield, but they are, of course, not members of NATO. There is no obligation for any other state to defend them. And even if EU members have signed something in the Lisbon Treaty referring to military assistance to each other, everybody knows that that is basically not worth the paper that it's written on. So there is a gap, if you like, in Finnish and Swedish defence strategy. They have declared that they will cooperate further with each other, including in equipment. They have had some joint equipment projects, and they will cooperate more closely with NATO. This was formalised at the Cardiff summit of NATO, and in particular it means that both of them will now prepare their own territory to have suitable facilities for NATO forces to come in, or the national forces of some other NATO member to come in, and have the correct technical specifications at airports and that kind of thing. This is technically host nation support. Finland actually has been doing this quietly for more than 10 years, but for Sweden it's a new development. All the countries have had to look at their individual defence strategies and defence budgets, and already Norway and Sweden have declared that there will be considerable increases in defence expenditure. We don't know the details yet. Finland was on the way to very large defence cuts. It was expected that it would cut 25 to 30% of its forces. We will see if now that might be somewhat delayed or reduced. But what I find interesting, and it fits with the long-term analysis of how the Nordics behave, is that the changes are really not all that dramatic. If you were an outsider, you might, for example, have expected that the Nordic states, the defence ministers, would give each other an assurance that they would at least defend each other, regardless of whether they're in NATO or not. In 2010, Sweden actually said to its neighbours that it would defend them, but the others have not given that promise back to Sweden. There is as yet no Nordic defence community. It's an interesting point. There are no big joint operations on land. They tend to be more about air and naval cooperation. There is no offer to help out the Baltic states, who are, of course, in a much more vulnerable position. That's basically left to NATO. It is very uncertain whether this will actually push Finland and Sweden further towards NATO. What it is doing is forcing them both to have an explicit debate on joining NATO. That debate has already been very open in Finland, among other things, because the Finnish president is quite in favour of it. And both in Finland and Sweden, there are some usually right-wing elements who do now say that we just have to simplify our situation by going into NATO. But the majority of political parties and of public opinion are quite strongly against it. And if you look at the composition of the new Swedish government that came in last autumn, it's actually somewhat more left-leaning than before. And the Finnish government, which has just been elected, is pretty much the same mixture as before of right and centre. And it is not at all certain that the political conditions are there for any fundamental change in relations with NATO. I may be wrong, but what I'm saying is that this issue is still very uncertain, whereas people looking from outside might have thought, oh, you know, Finland and Sweden obviously have to join NATO. And indeed, some of the commentaries have been implying that. But when you look at it in detail, it's not really true. Now, all these Nordic efforts have had some effect. I think the Nordic states themselves would say that they have put out a stronger position of their own will for defence and their solidarity with each other, even if it's not actually at the legal level of obligations, and that may have affected the Russian perception, made clear that these guys are not a soft target. Well, I mean, you may have an opinion on that. I'm not personally sure whether this particular picture will have shocked Mr. Putin very much. But what we can say is that the Nordic states have signalled to their friends, that is particularly signalled to the US and NATO and the large European powers, that they are not sleeping through this, they are not weak-minded, they do understand that Ukraine is also a defence challenge for them, and they are doing what they can within the framework of existing policy, budgets and public opinions. And I think myself that message that the Nordics are sending the West is actually more important for their survival than any small message that they're sending to Moscow. Indeed, the problem with Moscow is that the Nordic message might just be seen as a provocation. And when they say, oh, we know your propaganda and we're not going to be split, it might just encourage Moscow to send some better propaganda and to try harder to split the Nordics from each other. And the signs are that that is happening, and it will continue. Now, the second wing of Nordic policy remains to be good neighbours to Russia and to try to calm down the atmosphere and keep cooperation going. I have a quotation here which you can read for yourselves from the Danish Foreign Minister before Iqaluit, which is very clear. So you can see the last sentence is the important sentence. I think that's a very honest sentence, a very honest statement, and I think it reflects the wishes of all the Nordic states, in fact. Certainly when I was in the Faroes last week, there was no doubt that this was the way they wanted it to be. And I've already mentioned that Norway and Iceland are doing specific things to try to boost the Arctic cooperation with Russia, also outside the Arctic Council. Norway has just granted another 40 billion kroner to the Barents grouping, and Norway is putting new money and efforts into research cooperation with Russia, for example. So it's not even just standing still. The Norwegian case is actually very interesting, and 2 weeks ago I heard a briefing from one of their very senior foreign ministry officials, and I thought this was interesting to share with you as an example of the balancing act that a Nordic country has to maintain. And the Norwegian case is quite difficult because there are so many people, groups within Norway who benefit very strongly from cooperation with Russia in oil, gas, fishing, food exports, or whatever it might be. And that's another reason why the government cannot simply go over to a defense policy or a hostile policy, because it has to respect the opinions of its people, especially in the north, where generally they feel warmer towards Russia. And it's another reason for keeping a certain balance. Now, because of the Russian ban on Norwegian food exports, it's estimated that 7 billion kroner in fish exports has already been lost. But all those fish have been sold somewhere else. The industry hasn't actually lost the money. It's made up for it somewhere else. And of course it leaves a gap in the Norwegian-Russian trade, but the Norwegian government is working with industry to try to find other products and other kinds of cooperation. And indeed it gave money to print a glossy new magazine on Norwegian-Russian trade, a completely new initiative, encouraging people to come forward with ideas a year after, the seizure of the Crimea. It's quite interesting. They have, as I mentioned, cancelled military contacts and some high-level visits, but they have continued with the main mechanisms of cooperation, which are mostly expressed through commissions, meetings with officials on both sides to review cooperation, grant new money, decide on next steps. And they have all gone ahead. Two of them, the Nuclear Affairs and Environmental Commissions, were held at junior minister level, state secretary level, and the Economic Commission, where sanctions were more relevant, was held at senior official level. But they were all held. And it was also very interesting to know that although the military headquarters are not allowed to exchange visits anymore, the lines between them have kept open in case they have to carry out a search and rescue task together, because both sides apparently want to have that possibility, see it as a humanitarian matter, a moral matter, which really nobody should object to. And indeed, I would not object to it. And the way that the official summed it up is, we have lost some illusions. Note, we have lost some illusions, because of course Norway always knew there was a problem with Russia, it always knew it needed a firm defence, but now it sees that perhaps the second wing of its policy was not transforming Russia, was not really taking the problem away as much as people might have hoped. And he said, we will be more watchful in future, but we will actually pay more attention to Russia, talk to the Russians more, and try to understand them better. Because it is, of course, one of the oldest sayings in international relations, know your enemy. So the more serious the problem, the more serious we have to be about Russia, and the more understanding we need. And I thought that was very sensible. Now, in sum, and this is my last slide, how do we sum all this up? Do we conclude that the Nordic two-way policy, the defence and the desecuritization, has proved its value yet again in a very unusual and difficult situation in European security? Or do we say it's always been hard for the Nordics to balance in this way, and maybe it's getting harder? Maybe they cannot just sit on their old habits and their old formula. Well, I think both things are true. The North, the High North, has stayed reasonably calm throughout this crisis. Arctic cooperation has continued. And when the Russians have made provocative military signals in the North, it's pretty clear that they're aiming those signals at NATO as a whole. They're aiming them at the US, if you like. They're not preparing to invade Iceland. Wouldn't be worth it, actually, to do something just against the Nordics. Be realistic about that. Also, because the cooperation has continued, the economic benefits, such as they are, and they are now more modest, as I've said, for other reasons, but they are also continuing. And that is serving the interests of the northern parts of the countries concerned, and it means that there is no great disagreement over policy within the countries. Now, that's quite important for Nordic democracy. So I would say that these are positive things that can't really be denied. But if you want to raise some critical questions for the future, I think you can certainly do that too. Because the first thing to stress is that this balancing policy hasn't succeeded just because the Nordics convinced everybody else, or because they're powerful enough to keep doing this policy, whatever happens. No, the fact is that the US wants this policy. The European leading countries want this policy, and Russia itself at the moment seems to clearly want this policy. Russia itself wants to have it both ways, and does want the Arctic cooperation to continue. That is crystal clear at the moment, although it may change. So the question is, if the powerful Western players change their mind, or if Russia changed its mind, could the Nordics still carry out this very clever balancing act? And of course, that has to be a big question mark. Also, we can see clearly that there are problems on the defence side. The Nordics do depend on other people to be faithful to them. They have steadily cut their own defences in all four countries, actually, since the end of the Cold War. But they have not in a corresponding way strengthened their formal protection, because two of them are still outside NATO, and three of them are still outside the EU, to the extent that the EU offers additional security protection. And that might not matter if the Nordics formed a strong defence bloc where they shared everything and they gave absolute promises to each other. But as we have seen, that has not happened. And I think we're still quite a long way away from that happening. And it may be that the very fact that things have gone rather smoothly so far and the Arctic cooperation has kept going and most economic relations have kept going, you could argue that is somehow sheltering the Nordic governments from having to face up to the real difficulty of their position. I've said that I personally don't see a dramatic change of policy coming in any of the 5 states as things are at the moment. But is it right that they should just congratulate themselves and go on and not face up to the need for possibly greater change in the basic structure of their policies? I'm not answering that question one way or the other, but I think it is an interesting one to consider. And the final point is that, of course, the Arctic itself is an actor. The Arctic itself is a force for change. The global warming will continue. It will have all these negative effects that I mentioned before, mixing into this very delicate political and strategic situation. And that is genuinely something new today. In the Cold War, you knew where the limit of the ice was. That limit was more or less a limit on military activities or many military activities. And at least you knew that whatever else would change in Europe, the North would not change. Now the North, or the Arctic, is the biggest factor of change in this already, I think, very sensitive and fragile European security situation. And that's where I'd like to finish. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, Alyson. I think we have time for some questions from the floor, but before we do that, I'd just like to ask you one of my own, actually.
Okay.
Whenever Russia flexes its muscles abroad, we seem to hear commentators talk about a new Cold War or a restarted Cold War, or that it was naive to think that the Cold War ever ended. Yeah. And so I'm curious to see, how do you think that the current Nordic rhetoric and responses sit in comparison to the older Cold War rhetoric? Because this is an old debate in the Nordic countries. And maybe especially in terms of Finland, where this is such a strong situation, and they have in living memory a war with their neighbors.
If I can answer the second part of that first, I think it's a correct perception that the balance of Nordic policies and the way that the Nordics tell themselves this story has not changed very much. Because I would argue the strategic geography has not changed. They are the ones that are still sitting with Russia on their borders. They can't just ignore it in the way that some Western or Southern states can. Even the fact that they have to interact positively with Russia means that Russia remains a large reality for them, and that they have to consider their dependence on Russia as a potential problem, just as their potential dependence on the US is acknowledged as a problem. So I think that the thinking in the Nordic states has actually never changed that much. The awareness of Russia has always been there, but it has led to this two-track approach where the balance is actually peaceful, the balance is actually to produce stability. So I don't see a huge difference there. Maybe just a little bit twist where the pro-defense elements in each country are allowed to speak more loudly. But the crisis has been going on for about 15 months now, and I think we see in all the countries that voices on the other side are coming back, voices saying, don't be too provocative, we have to live with Russia. Even some voices saying, this isn't our problem. And I think it's quite natural that there are voices saying that. So this Nordic balance has not actually changed very much, in my view. If you take the proposition as such, are we going back to the Cold War? Of course, the answer is that that is completely ridiculous. I mean, you are somebody in Estonia or Croatia or Albania who happen to belong to NATO now, whereas in the old days they were far behind an iron curtain with massive concentration of Russian conventional nuclear troops all over Central Europe. Ask Germany, are you actually reunited or not? You know, clearly we are not in a Cold War situation. And I think myself that the US and Russian governments probably understand that better than anyone else. And China, I mean, all the big powers understand this better than anyone else. It's just that in some of the smaller states of Europe, they think that this kind of noise and this kind of language will make people feel sorry for them and help them more, which again is not necessarily a good calculation.
That's very interesting. Are there any questions?
Or comments?
First, well, I would like to comment on your anecdote on the Canadian history as such.
Oh yeah.
But State Secretary Kerry, interestingly, has invited his Arctic counterparts in joining him in launching the U.S. chairmanship in Washington next week.
Yeah, there you go.
And they have no problem at all inviting Lavrov, obviously.
Right.
It would be interesting to see whether he turns up or not. But my question would
Yeah.
be on the Nordic. How do you see the Nordic Declaration on Solidarity, which was signed in 2011
Yeah.
On the basis of the Stoltenberg report,
Yeah.
in terms of Arctic security?
It's very good that you raise that, because I know I had to go over that point a little bit quickly when it's really very complicated. Yes, in that year, the 5 foreign ministers made this declaration that they would definitely or automatically give help to each other in serious emergencies, which might be natural disasters, non-state attacks such as terrorist attacks or cyber attacks, which were particularly mentioned. Then it explicitly excluded military attack. So it was clearly not a defense commitment, and they were very, very clear about that. It was a universal promise, so it referred to their high north or Arctic territories just as much as anywhere else. And I think it gave a very important political base for the development of joint security activities, such as greater search and rescue cooperation, greater cooperation against environmental disasters, greater cyber cooperation, which has again been mentioned now by the defense ministers. So very important, but not a military guarantee. And another thing about this that was really interesting is that the areas that they were talking about, so terrorist attack, law and order, natural disasters, are not the responsibility of foreign ministers. When you think about it, they are the responsibility of justice or interior ministers, as they are here in Iceland. And apparently those ministers were not consulted before the declaration was made. That's an embarrassing little secret. But of course they afterwards all said, well, this is a great thing and this will encourage us to deepen our cooperation.
Good. Time for more questions?
Yeah, maybe. I was wondering, for the past 10 years or so, we've had Nordic and Canadian chairmanship in the Arctic Council. And this neighborliness game that we play with Russia and Russia participates in, do you think it would change with the US chairmanship? Because, I mean, given history, the communication hasn't always been very
I think the US-Russian relationship has always been a double relationship. Just like the Nordic one, you only have to think back to the Cold War when American farmers got huge profits from selling grain to Russia and supporting the communist regime because the people were not starving. So I think there is this general sophistication and double nature in US policy. But as for the Arctic more particularly, the very simple thing that I always say to remind myself when this question comes up is the US Arctic territory is Alaska. The US Arctic territory is not in this part of the world where the shockwaves from Ukraine are being felt. And if you look at the way that Alaska and Northeast Russia work together, from everything I've heard, it's just fine. And the Coast Guards and the navies work together, there is fisheries protection. There is not a big multinational grouping like the Barents Council, but that's because the Japanese cannot forget their historical disputes with the Russians. And I guess it was not worth having just a sort of council of two countries, but apparently the US and Russia do behave very well together there. And that is the reality that the US will be starting from. And it's what the US is starting from when it makes its own Arctic strategy. The US is relatively little interested in everything going on around here, which is partly why the Nordics have to send a signal to Washington saying, hey, don't forget us, we do have certain problems. But all the commentary and all the signs I've seen are that people have good hopes for the US chairmanship. The only concerns that have been expressed are maybe that the US is still not serious enough. I mean, still not putting enough resources in, for example. Other?
Just a comment on this,
yes.
Because I think what complicated the chairmanship in Canada, for instance, is the extensive Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, as opposed to other Arctic countries.
Well, if we can talk about this, I think, yes, the Ukrainian diaspora and presumably others like Polish diaspora or whatever, Baltic diaspora, have an influence. Secondly, it is the most nationalistic government Canada has ever had. Let's be frank about that. Thirdly, the chairman that they chose for the Arctic Council may be an Indigenous lady, which is a wonderful thing, Indigenous lady, but very right-wing and not a peaceful person at personal level, as far as I know. Then the Canadians are always looking over their shoulders at their autonomous territories in the north, Nunavut and Nunatsiaq, who are seeking more rights and a more independent voice in Arctic affairs. But the Canadian government is not willing to give that to them. So they gave them the honour of holding the meeting up there in Iqaluit in Nunavut, but they didn't actually give them any proper role in the process. All of these things, I think, undermined the Canadian chairmanship, gave it a bad flavour. I don't see anything similar in the US. From what I hear, the indigenous peoples on the north slope of Alaska are in a very happy position of being very much involved in all the contracts for oil and gas development and able to defend their own interests in that context. I hope there was no one here from the Canadian Embassy, because it's not their fault. It's the fault of Ottawa. And there will be elections in Canada before too long, so we'll have to see what will happen.
And with those recommendations, I think we will call it a day. Thank you very much, Alyson, for your very interesting talk. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you all very much. That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.